FileZilla is available as both an FTP server and an FTP client, although this tutorial will only cover the FTP client portion. I'll place a link on screen here to another tutorial that I've done on using the FTP server portion. FileZilla is open source and available free of charge. It supports FTP and SFTP. It also supports Microsoft Windows, Linux, and Mac. Let's download and install the FileZilla client. Open a web browser like Internet Explorer. In the address bar, enter FileZilla-project.org and then press enter. On the FileZilla homepage, there are download buttons for both the FileZilla client as well as the server. Let's click the Download FileZilla client button. On the client download page, click the Download Now button under Windows. This will bring us to the download on the SourceForge.net website. On the download information bar, click on the Run button. This will download the file and then automatically start the installer. On the license agreement screen, read the license agreement, and then click the I agree button. On the Choose Installation Options screen, the option is available to install for anyone, or limited it to just install for the currently logged in user. Let's leave it as the default of anyone, and then click the Next button. On the Choose Component screen, click the Select Desktop icon in addition to the other options that are selected, and then click the Next button. On the Choose Install Location screen, click the Next button. On the Choose Start Menu folder screen, click the Install button. On the Completing screen, deselect Start FileZilla Now, and then click the Finish button. I don't want FileZilla to start automatically because I want to show you the two ways that you can go about opening the FileZilla client. Option 1, you can double-click on the FileZilla client icon on the desktop. Option 2, you can click on the Windows Start button, All Programs, FileZilla FTP client, and then select FileZilla. Let's review the FileZilla client interface. At the top of the window is the various FileZilla menus, such as File, Edit, View, Transfer, Server, Bookmarks, and Help. Below the menu is a toolbar, which contains buttons like the Open the Site Manager button and a Search button. Below the menu is the Quick Connect bar. The Quick Connect bar stores previous connection information that can be used to quickly reconnect back to a server you have already accessed without having to retype all the information. Below the Quick Connect bar is the message log. The message log is used to log and display system events, such as when a transfer has started or stopped. The center of the window contains the local pane on the left and the remote pane on the right. The local pane displays a directory tree of the files and directories on the local computer. The remote pane displays the files and directories on the server that the FileZilla client is connected to. At the bottom of the window is the transfer queue. The transfer queue shows the queued files by default, but can also show the failed transfers as well as the successful transfers. Let's connect to an FTP server. I'll be connecting to a FileZilla FTP server running on this local computer. Again, I have already done a tutorial on the FileZilla server portion and how to set this up. I'll place another link on screen here that will link you to the FileZilla server setup if you want to do that before continuing. When you connect to a new server, you can either connect using the Quick Connect bar, or you can open the Site Manager and create a new permanent site. The Quick Connect bar is used to make a quick connection to a server that you don't plan on accessing regularly, and you want to connect to with basic settings. A history of the servers you connect to will be stored so you can access them again easily if you want. To connect using the Quick Connect bar, you only need 4 pieces of information. Host. The host is the address of the FTP server you want to access. In many cases, FTP sites are open for anyone to access anonymously. These won't require a username and password. There are tons of FTP sites out there to download software, including the Linux mirror at kernel.org, that we'll be using for this testing. This server does allow anonymous access. So next to host, we'll enter FTP ftp.kernel.org. Username and password. Some FTP sites will be private and require a username and password. FTP sites for businesses will typically fall into this category. In this case, we're just going to leave these blank, which will denote that this is an anonymous access. Port. If the server used a port other than the standard FTP port of 21, then you could enter that here. If you're not sure, just leave it as the default of blank, and that'll enter port 21 for you. Now we just click on the Quick Connect button. Once a connection is successful, a directory listing will appear in the remote pane. If we scroll up in the message log, we can see a log of what happened during this connection. First, it resolves the address we entered of ftp.kernel.org. It then shows it's connecting to the resolved IP address for the name of 149.20.4.69. After the IP address, there's a colon followed by the number 21. This is the port used for the connection. Port 21 is the default FTP port. We can then see connection established. As we work with the FileZilla, it will log information to this message log pane. Let's disconnect from the server so that we can create a new site. To disconnect, we just click on the Disconnect from the currently visible server button. If you're going to access a server regularly, or you want to have special settings, you should create a new site with the Site Manager. You can open the Site Manager by either clicking the File menu and then Site Manager, or you can click on the Open the Site Manager button here. The Site Manager window will open. Let's start by clicking the New Site button. We'll call this Local Server, although you can name it anything you want. Press Enter. Now let's go through and set the various settings for this new connection. On the General tab, Host. In this case, I'm going to enter localhost for the host. Localhost is an alias telling the system to look at itself. You'll probably enter a domain name such as ftpsite.com or an IP address such as 192.168.123.123. Entering localhost here is the same as entering the IP address of this computer that I'm on. Port. If this is left blank, it assumes that you're using the default FTP port of 21. If the server you're trying to access uses a port other than 21, you can go ahead and enter that here. Protocol. Here we can select using the default of FTP, or we can change it so that it uses SFTP. Encryption. Here we can select from several encryption options. This server doesn't use any encryption, so we'll leave it to use plain FTP. Logon type. By default, it'll connect to the server with an anonymous login. This grays out the username and password information below, and we'll just connect with an anonymous login. We'll click the drop-down. You'll see that there are options for normal login, which will allow us to enter username and password here. Ask for a password, which will allow us to enter the username and then prompt for the password on connecting. And then interactive and an account, which I won't go into. We're going to select normal from the drop-down. Now the options are not grayed out for user and password. User. Here we'll enter the username, which for the server is user1. This is case sensitive, so notice here I do have the capital U. If your server uses uppercase letters, then you're going to have to use those as well. Password. Enter the password for the account, which in this case is password. It does only ask you once, so make sure that you enter it correctly. Advanced tab. Server type. Here we can set the type of server we are connecting to, although I would always leave this as auto-detect. If you knew you were connecting to a Unix system, you could select that here, and then it would only use the character sets and such that were required for this server. Auto-detect always works, so I will just leave it there. Default local directory. Here we can set the directory on our computer that will be the default local path to copy files. Let's click the Browse button. The Browse for Folder window will open. Let's select the folder we want to use as the default local directory. I'll explain computer. On my X drive, which is my storage drive. I have a folder here called FTP. And within that folder, there's a folder called local. I'll select this local folder and then click the OK button. Default remote directory. When we connect to this FTP server, it'll place us in the default directory on the server. If we have access to another folder on the server, we can enter its information here, and we'll then start off in that directory after connecting, rather than in the predefined route. Adjust server time zone offset. In many cases, the server you're accessing will be in a different time zone than you. This will throw off the times that you upload and download files, so that they won't match with real time. If the server was in the West Coast time, but we were on the East Coast, we could set this to -3 hours. Transfer Settings tab. Transfer mode. The default mode is passive. Passive mode requires far less configuration, so use that unless you have some specific reason to use active instead. Passive mode requires far less configuration, so use that unless you have some specific reason to use active instead. Now let's go to the Character Set tab. Unless there's some problem displaying characters, leave this set to auto-detect. Just keep in mind that if there are problems displaying the characters, you can adjust the settings here, and that may help the problem. Now all we need to do is click the OK button to save the settings for this new site. Let's clear the log so we don't get any information confused. Right-click, Clear Log. Now to connect to the server with the new local server site that we created, let's click the drop-down arrow next to the Open Site Manager button. And we can see here that local server site that we just created is listed. If there were more than one site, they would be shown up here, one underneath the other. So now we just need to click on Local Server. We can see from the message log that we're logged into the server now. If we look at both the local pane and the remote pane, we can see that they are broken up into a top and bottom. The top pane of each section contains a directory tree showing the folders that are in the local and remote sites. The bottom pane contains the files and folders inside the folder selected in the directory tree above. As we change the directories, we can see that the files will change. Let's review navigating the directories on the remote site. If we look at the remote site, we can see that we were placed in the root directory on the server that's represented as just a /. I have a test file for testing on the root file, and there's also a folder called Private Link. If we double-click on the Private Link folder, it'll open it up. We'll then see a new text file called private.txt that shows us that we're in the Private Link directory. We can move back to the parent directory by double-clicking on the folder link at the top that has 2 dots in it. Anytime you see 2 dots, that just brings you to the parent directory. And now we know we're back in our normal directory because we have the normal users.txt file here. This is something I just placed here so that we would know we were in the root directory. Let's transfer some files. On the local site side, we can see that by default we're placed in XFTP local directory. This is from our site manager settings earlier. To transfer the file, we can drag and drop them from the remote site to the local site. We can see that when I hover, the mouse is represented by a new icon that has a little plus at the bottom right. This shows you that you could drag and drop the file here. Here we can see that it's the little no smoking sign that represents that you can't copy it over here. So that's option 1. You can also just double-click on the file to transfer it between the 2 open panes. As long as you're in a directory where you have correct permissions, you can create new directories or files in either the local or remote pane. The user I'm logged in as, user 1, does not have permission in the root directory on the server. But we're going to test and see what happens anyways. To create a new directory, we're going to right-click on the pane and then select Create Directory. The Create Directory window will open with the default name of /new directory. You can change the name to anything you want. We'll just leave it as new directory and then click the OK button. We can see we get a message stating can't create directory, permission denied. Let's move into the private link directory. This is a private folder that just this user has access to. Now let's try the same steps as before. Right-click, create new directory. We can see now that it's /private link and then /new directory. This denotes that it will be creating a new directory inside the private link folder. So we're going to change this name to test. Keep in mind here that you have to have the // in front of this, or it won't work. Click the OK button, and we can now see that we have a new folder named Test. The last thing that I want to review in the FileZilla client is the transfer queue. If you've told FileZilla to transfer files faster than it can keep up with them, they will start to stack up in the Queued Files tab on the transfer queue. Our transfers have completed, so we have nothing in our queued files or our failed transfers. Let's change to the Successful Transfers tab, where we can see our completed transfers. If there were problems with the transfer, they would show up in the Failed Transfers tab here. Reviewing the information here should give you an idea as to the problem that was encountered. Once we're finished working with the server, we can click on this button to disconnect from the currently visible server. You should now have the FileZilla client downloaded and installed, as well as a good understanding of the interface, how to connect to the server, how to create a new site, how to navigate to the directories, and then how to transfer the files.